Good evening, everyone. Happy holidays from New Hampshire International Dyslexia Association, serving Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. I'm Brenda Peters, president of New Hampshire IDA. Welcome to our Read for Parents webinar featuring the esteemed Louisa Moats, Dr. Louisa Moats. As a branch, we are thrilled to provide these every other month Read for Parent webinars, which focus on different IDA fact sheets. As a parent years ago navigating the special education process, I found the IDA fact sheets to be a great tool in informing me on what I call the journey of dyslexia. As many of you parents and practitioners can probably relate, getting structured literacy instruction for students in need is more often than not a difficult journey for parents, students, and even teachers. As a branch, we are honored to bring these informative sessions to you. Today, in support of today's session, we have Andrea Pollock. Andrea is from New Hampshire and is managing the technical aspects of our webinar. Chris Riley is our incoming vice president from New Hampshire as well. Chris will be adding links and content and resources to the chat, so check the chat frequently. Heidi Zollman from New Hampshire is our amazing conference chair and will facilitate a brief question and answer at the end as time allows with Doreen Dorfman from Vermont, who serves on our legislative committee. Note, please, certificates of attendance are not issued for our Read for Parent sessions, so you will not be getting certificates. We hope you'll all still attend. Today's webinar will be posted on our website within a week. So you will find all the resources today from our session, as well as our previous Read for Parent sessions. Please consider joining New Hampshire IDA, our branch. Remember, we represent New Hampshire, Maine, and Vermont. There are many advantages, including connecting with our community, staying informed, great benefits like you need to check out the IDA TV, it's pretty awesome, and expanding your network, either with other parents or your professional network. There are a variety of membership levels. I'm sure you can find one that matches you. And just to point out, classroom teachers, if this is your first year of membership in IDA, it is free, so you can't beat that. New Hampshire IDA, remember, representing the 3 states, is very active. We have 6 Read for Parents each year. We have an October conference that we are really excited about this year. We have a collaboration with the Wilson Reading System twice a year. We also have an annual Project Read program webinar coming up in January, our newsletter in February and August, and we always have scholarships for all of our different programs, so definitely check out our scholarships. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Louisa Moats. Dr. Moats has been a teacher, psychologist, researcher, and graduate school faculty member and author of many influential scientific journal articles, books, and policy papers on the topics of reading, spelling, language, and teacher preparation. After a first job as a neuropsychology technician, she became a teacher of students with learning and reading difficulties. Earning her master's degree at Peabody College of Vanderbilt, later, after realizing how little she understood about teaching reading, she earned a doctorate in reading and human development from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Dr. Moats spent the next 15 years in practice as a licensed psychologist in Vermont, yay, Vermont, specializing in evaluation and consultation with individuals of all ages and walks of life who experience reading, writing, and language difficulties. Dr. Moats is most well known for her research and writing about the need for improvements in teacher education. Welcome, Dr. Moats. We are so thrilled to have you tonight talking to us about spelling and dyslexia. Don't forget, folks, put your questions in the chat. And Dr. Moats, thank you for coming, and we're so thrilled to have you here.
All right, let's see if I can call up some slides. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And now I'm trying to figure out where my slides went, but I think there they are. Okay, we're in business. Yes, I was in Vermont for many years in private practice. I still have many connections there. In fact, I still own a little house in Fairleigh, Vermont that I get back to for a few weeks each year. And but I'm talking to you tonight from Sun Valley, Idaho, where I have been living with my husband for the last almost 20 years. So I would say that the topic of spelling is my favorite thing to talk about because on one hand, people treat it as if it should be simple. And on the other hand, it is probably the most difficult thing for people with dyslexia to master and to make significant progress in, and it remains a lifelong challenge, even for people with dyslexia who have overcome their reading disability to a large extent and are able to read and get along in life. Spelling is the monster that is hard to corral and conquer. So I've always been fascinated by this. And I'm going to just touch on some high points about things that I've come to understand over the last, let's see, I did my dissertation in 1982. So this would be a good 40 years of doing research, looking at the research, and trying to come to an understanding about why spelling is so darn difficult for people with dyslexia, and also understanding what we can do about it, and how our methods of instruction might be improved. So let's start with this. I always like to start with, let's see if I can get this to work. Okay, I like to start with a spelling test. So those of you who have a pencil handy, you could jot down these words or just spell them, in your own mind as I dictate them. So the first word for you to spell is commitment. And commitment is a very common word for us in reading, speaking, and spelling. The second word is accommodate. And of course, when we're using the language of intervention, we often use the term accommodate, but I want to know if you can spell that word. And the last word is iridescence. And I give you that word because I know it's one that you can read, but that you don't often write. So let's see what happens when you try to spell iridescence. Well, this is how you spell these words. And I promise you, when I do this little spelling test, as I have done many times with large audiences and large audiences of educated people who are considered very literate, if I say, how many of you made an error on at least one of these words, 2/3 of the hands go up. And that to me is a non-scientific but yet interesting way of seeing again how much more challenging spelling is than reading. So as we consider why spelling these words might be challenging, we have to ask the question, well, how do we know a word? And if we know a word, what do we know about a word? In modern science, which is, enriched by many disciplines, not only developmental linguistics and education intervention studies and neuroscientific studies of what's going on in the brain and studies of spelling errors and so on. They've kind of portrayed what a mental image of a word contains. And one way I would describe it is it's like a layer cake of language concepts that are built on one another. And that layer cake of language concepts is represented in our print system. So with the word commitment, for example, if we know a lot about the word, we have processed the fact that it has a Latin prefix, root, and suffix. Even if we don't know explicitly that it's from Latin, we know that com, is a word part that's used very often in the beginnings of words, that have a common root like mit, and then the suffix ment we've learned as a unit. In this word, all of these morphemes, our meaningful parts, are spelled consistently. So if we know the morphemes and recognize them, we're more likely to spell the word correctly. But also we need to know something about print conventions, and there are some rules for adding suffixes to roots and base words. And those rules tell us that if the suffix begins with a consonant, as the suffix ment begins with a consonant, then when we add it to a root like mit, we don't have to double anything. But one of the common errors that people make, if they don't know that rule, is they double the T in commitment because they're unsure. But with accommodate, we have to ask, well, why are there two T's two C's in accommodate and two M's in accommodate? And we have to know something else about word structure in order to know for sure which letters are doubled in this word. Otherwise, it's guesswork. And when I ask people, what did you get wrong when you misspelled it? They often say they left out one of the M's, or they left out one of the C's. So learning this word and knowing that it has two C's and two M's in turn depends on having a concept of how the word is structured, that there's what we call an assimilated prefix in the form of AC, which is a changed form of the prefix ad, which in Latin means to or toward. And when ad gets added to commodus, which is the Latin root, I looked it up, the form of it gets changed so that it's easier to say. It's hard to say ad commodus in Latin. It's easier to say accommodus in Latin. And then with iridescence, in order to learn how to spell that word, we have to know that it's not like the word irrational that has an assimilated prefix. In fact, it's a word where IRI is the Greek root that is related to or derived from or representative of the Greek goddess of color or the rainbow. And if you know the name Iris, the flower iris. That is an association you can make to remember iridescence, because the word iris comes from that same root. So what I'm modeling here is a way of thinking about spelling that involves much more than simply rote memorization of a letter string. That's really not what's involved at all. And it certainly involves much more than simple sound symbol correspondence. We don't get very far in spelling if all we're doing is writing a letter or even a letter combination that represents a single speech sound. And that's one reason why English spelling is much more difficult than some of the other more transparent languages that exist in the world. Now, everything I've said so far points to the fact that spelling is a linguistic skill. It is not a rote visual memory process. And how do we know that? We know that from studies like all the ones I've listed here, that reading and spelling development are mediated by phonological awareness, just as reading is mediated by phonological awareness. And spelling depends not only on awareness of phonemes, but also on awareness of spoken syllables, how many there are, and their stress patterns, and morphemes. And it depends on a kind of specialized memory for what we call orthographic units that are stored in the brain's word form area in the back of the brain. So this is a brain image, a diagram, a schematic based on the work of Stanislaus Dehaene, whose book Reading in the Brain is one of my Bibles, if you will. But he has discovered a lot about the nature of this visual word form area, or what he calls the brain's letterbox. It's kind of standard parlance now in neuroscience. But this area has very specialized memory capacities that allow us to store the orthographic patterns in words, and to store those orthographic patterns as representations of these various linguistic units. So you can say that spelling is a form of language memory and a form of language expression. It is mistakenly referred to as a rote visual memory capacity. Rote visual memory does not get you very far. And those of you who are dyslexic or have kids who are dyslexic, you know that just drilling kids on letter strings is very frustrating and unproductive. And those letter strings don't stick unless kids have a more well-developed idea of what those letters are representing, how those letters are being used. So reading and spelling have a lot in common. Of course, they both depend on language, and these systems of language underlie both. However, the demands of each are somewhat different, as we will see. This is one way that I like to bring home the point about the separation of the language processes on which spelling depends and the visual processes that underlie artistic ability or mechanical ability or mapping ability in spatial relationships. This was a client I evaluated when I was in private practice in Vermont. He was a student at a very small rural school. It took until 7th grade for him to be referred for an independent evaluation. His full-scale IQ, as it turned out, was in the high average range, 110, 75th percentile. The student was bright, and nevertheless, his reading scores were third, fourth grade level at best, and his spelling was stuck at around the third grade level. And you can see that he was a self-taught artist. He never had an art lesson. There was no art teacher at this school, but he had learned how to depict shadow and movement and proportion. It's really quite remarkable what he did when I just said, draw a figure, as we all of us did in psychological evaluations at the time, because it's just something part of the routine to see, incidentally, well, can the student draw? And it was really very impressive. But he could do that, and he couldn't remember that the word ride was R-I-D-E. So underlying both reading and spelling, and they are two sides of the same coin with some clear variations, it is the two-way ability that we call orthographic mapping. And what orthographic mapping involves is a rapid and efficient mental construction of a mental correspondence between the pronunciation of a word and the letters that are representing that pronunciation. And this is what underlies the learning of both what we consider to be regular words and irregular words. And I think it's Dave Kilpatrick who, in his book on essentials of learning to read, and whatever is in the title, but it's his book from 2015, where this is explained most clearly. I love Kilpatrick's very careful and detailed explanations of what goes on in our minds when we learn to read and spell a word. But what he's showing with diagrams like this is that if we know how to pronounce a word like red, and we want to learn to spell it, we have to take apart the sounds red in order to map these letters. That's very straightforward. In order to learn the word has, it's a somewhat more oblique process because the last sound in has is z, but the letter we use to represent that is S. So what we have to do to spell has is to say to ourselves, well, the letter S is representing Z, not the letter Z, as I've been taught. Or fortunately, we do have instructional systems that point this out very early in instruction, which is a good thing. But when we get to a word like have, is there any reason why we should separate it out and teach it in a completely different way? Well, the answer to that is emphatically no. Because in order to learn the word have and to spell the word have and read the word have, we have to go through the same process of mapping the letter sequence to the pronunciation of the word. It's just a process that's going to take a little bit more cognitive reckoning, if you will. So we say have is have. Oh, well, what are the letters in have? H-A-V-E. What is the letter E doing there? That's a curiosity because the three sounds are represented by H, A, and V. So it helps to have an explanation that the letter E is there to keep the word from ending in the letter V, which is not allowed in the English writing system. So in this case, the letter E is not reaching over the consonant and tapping the vowel and making it say its long sound. It's not doing that. It has a different job. So one of the important ways of approaching spelling for kids is to start right out with the expectation that the letters in English have different jobs to do. And kids are perfectly capable of learning this. It's just that the student with dyslexia will need to learn in a more incremental, piecemeal way. But the fundamental concept that letters have different jobs to do is very important to instill in the outset. As Wesley Hoover has said in his marvelous new book on the psychology of reading, we have to establish a set for diversity, because that is the system of representation that we are going to be working with, and there's no way around it. Now, of course, this intermediate process of breaking the word into its speech sounds in order to engage the orthographic mapping process is critical. And as we said, because in the paper I wrote with Kassar, Treeman, Polo, and Kessler in 2005, we concluded in a study of dyslexic kids that phonology, although important for all aspects of literacy learning, is even more critical in learning to spell than in learning to read. Orthographic knowledge is laid over a phonological foundation. If that phonological foundation is weak, orthographic skills cannot develop sufficiently to support good spelling and compensate for the underdeveloped phonological skills. This is a bit of an aside for you more advanced professionals, but there's an online debate going on now about what the National Reading Panel really said about teaching phonological skills, and people who are arguing that you can teach phonological skills just by using letters, and that is wrong. And I'm about to issue a statement with Dave Kilpatrick and others about why that inference is wrong. First of all, it's not what the National Reading Panel said or meant. And also, we have to view the processing of speech and the ability to segment speech and manipulate speech sounds mentally as the intermediate underlying skill that allows us to engage in mapping print to speech efficiently. So it is not the same thing as matching letters to sounds. It is the process of becoming aware of the sound structure of speech. So how do we illustrate this? One way I illustrate what's challenging about learning to spell is to look carefully at the errors of novices. And in this case, this is a first grader. And there's lots of analysis we can do with this, but one of the things that this writing sample shows is that to acquire phoneme awareness, the student needs to differentiate between speech sounds that are very similar, but that are different entities in our speech sound system. So one example of this is p and b. The word that was dictated was mob. The letter that the student wrote was P. The student knows that P represents the P in pet and the P in rope, but for some reason, the student processed the last sound of mob as the same as P. That's what we call a voicing error because P and B differ only in voicing. That is how we say those sounds. Everything else about the articulation is the same, except for whether the voice box is turned on or off. So immediately when I look at that, I say to myself, this student needs instruction. And over here, by the way, blade, the student uses the letter B. So what the student needs here is practice distinguishing the difference between voiced and voiceless consonants in speech when they occur at the ends of words as well as when they occur in the beginnings. Because here we have the sound ch in chunk. The student doesn't know the digraph CH for spelling, but it's interesting that the student chose the letter G to represent the ch in chunk. So J, G, the sound J is the voiced version of the voiceless ch. And in order to teach, we want the student to understand both how you spell j and also how you spell ch. So in teaching ch, here's the difference in the way I think from the way some, for example, OG programs present this. If I'm teaching ch, I don't want to just teach the concept of a digraph because that doesn't help the student. The student needs to have a firm mental representation of the sound ch, and that it's different from j. And then when that mental representation is firmed up through phonological tasks that give practice and contrast these sounds, the student is much better prepared to learn that CH represents ch, and that it's the same sound on the end of coach, for example. So I could go along on that a long time, but we don't have all night. So this is one reason, those sorts of errors that indicate that one of the challenges for novice spellers and certainly dyslexic spellers is to sort out what is in the spoken word, what those phonological constituents are, and to be able to do that efficiently, as Dave Kilpatrick says, to do it without a lot of mental effort and time. So I am an advocate for starting the spelling of the teaching of spelling with explicit teaching of the speech sound system, which is not the same as phonics. It is the system by which we construct spoken words from these elements that we call phonemes. And they, in the consonant system, there are pairs that differ only in voicing. There are 9 of them, for example. And there are groups of sounds that have properties in common. For example, there are 3 nasal sounds in English, n, and ng. I was in my 30s before I was explicitly taught that ng is the 3rd nasal sound in English. Why didn't I know that? Because we do not have a special letter for that sound. So it tends to get lost in instruction and people confuse it as a combination of 2 sounds and so on. And it is not. It is its own nasal sound in the back of the throat. And then, if students don't know the identity of the phonemes when they start to spell, what is going to happen? Well, these mental anchors or parking spots, these phonemes constituents of the words are going to be fuzzy or out of place or poorly defined. So we won't have a mental Velcro to attach these letters and letter combinations to, if that is the case. And the result then is that students try to memorize letter sequences by visual imprinting or by using extraneous information, such as the configuration around the word or some kind of irrelevant contextual information that isn't going to hold up when they have to really remember how that given word is distinguished from others. And vowels, what about vowels? Well, a lot of programs teach that a vowel is A, E, I, or U. Well, that is not helpful in learning to spell. In learning to spell, what one has to do is become aware of the vowel sound as the nucleus of each spoken syllable. And again, I was in my 30s before anyone taught me this explicitly, but there are 18 vowel sounds in English. And when I use the word vowel, I only use the word vowel for a speech sound that is the nucleus of a syllable. And then if I'm talking about the letters that we use to represent vowels, I'm talking about single letters and letter combinations, A, E, I, O, and U, and also W and Y, and sometimes GH in those combinations. So also from the study of spelling errors, we know, let's go back to mob again. Why would a student pick the letter I for the sound ah? Clearly, this student is at what we call an early alphabetic stage of learning to spell, according to Linnea Erie's phase theory. And the student knows some of the consonants, especially is especially pretty good at picking out the beginning consonant and sometimes the ending consonant. But the concept of a vowel being what is in the middle is very underdeveloped still, and that will come next with explicit instruction. But the student made a good stab here and used the letter I for ah. Does that make any sense? And the student used the letter O for Does that make any sense? Well, I've learned from the study of the vowel system in speech that it does make sense. And let's see. Yes. Okay. So these are all of the vowels in English. And again, to spell, one must develop an internal sense of each of these vowels and the identity of them. How do we do that? We do that by distinguishing them in speech. So E is high front vowel, E, I, A, I, ah. And my jaw has gone down a step for each of these vowels. So by the time I get to ah, my jaw is open, my tongue is down. And then for these vowels, we call the back vowels, my jaw is going to close up, o, oo, and u. Oo or long U has two forms, an unglided form, oo, and a glided form, u. And we can argue about this, how to represent it. There is no, agreement. And then there are two diphthongs. A diphthong is a slider vowel. Oi and ow are the prominent ones in English. Sometimes I is described as a diphthong by linguists. That's accurate. And then we have, on my chart, three R-controlled vowels, R, and or. And spelling those is horrific, but the first step is detecting them in the spoken word, R, or, and then we can deal with the vagaries of how they're represented. It's very difficult for dyslexic kids. And this is schwa, floating in the middle. That's the indistinct vowel that's pronounced So why would a student choose I for the in mob? Because they're extremely close in articulation. And why would the student choose an O or represent the in whatever that word was with an O? Because and are very close in articulation. So these are what we call the low open vowels, I, and students who are paying attention to what their mouth is doing when they try to sound out a word may readily substitute one letter for another with those vowels. Okay, now what we know about familiar words, again, when we know a word well, how is it stored in our memory? What do we have to learn about a word? Let's go back to where I started. What do we have to learn about a word in order to spell it? Let's pick a pretty easy word here, snowing. Well, do we just remember it as a letter string? Well, again, the answer is no. We remember these letters as representations of linguistic units. And what are those linguistic units? They are the morphemes, snow-ing. They are the syllables, snow-ing. They overlap here, but don't always. The graphemes, which are the letters and letter combinations that represent the phonemes. So in this case, OW represents O and NG represents So there are 5 phonemes in the word. And by definition, if there are 5 phonemes, there have to be 5 graphemes. And then we, of course, have to know the letters and letter naming, letter identification, letter discrimination is prerequisite for me being able to learn graphemic representations and orthographic mapping. Another way to depict this in terms of how we teach spelling is that we layer these concepts of language and language representation on one another. And these layers do bleed into one another and overlap. So it is not true that we have to delay the teaching of morphology until kids have learned all the phoneme grapheme correspondences, for example. But we need to inform our instruction by through a diagnostic process where we evaluate where a student is in their progression of learning. And again, back to Linnea Airy's phase theory, which I've always found extremely informative. She has shown that between the ages of 4 and 6, for most kids, they go through a developmental process whereby they start without an understanding of the alphabetic principle and just string letters together that look like writing. And of course, we have more research from Rebecca Treeman, who is the world's expert on this, on spelling development, in my opinion, where kids show through their early attempts that they do notice things about letters in print. They notice that certain ones are doubled and that these vowel letters are alternated with consonants and things like that. And they're permissible letter sequences or common ones. But they don't know how the letters are representing sound. The next phase is the early alphabetic or very partial alphabetic understanding where they can use letters to represent a few of the speech sounds in words. And often their representations are very economical at the beginning of this process, just a few letters for the sounds they recognize. And then in a later alphabetic phase, more of the sounds are represented. And then in the consolidated phase, kids have integrated what they have learned about how we actually use letters and letter sequences and patterns. They're able to engage in this orthographic mapping process where the letter string is mapped to the sounds in words, and they get there by being taught how print is used. For example, learning about the FLS doubling rule and why the word will has 2 L's on it. I like to say in my writing and my teaching that learning to spell depends on learning about language, learning about spoken language and written language from 5 different major angles. I like to envision a prism of some kind with 5 facets, because all of these angles are potentially informative when students are learning to spell words. So one is the language of origin. A second one is phoneme grapheme correspondences, of course, the base layer of representation. Next is the position of a phoneme or grapheme in a word that has to do with the graphemes that are used in the spelling patterns that are used in that word. And then letter order and sequence patterns that exist in our orthography that can be quite arbitrary. Things like we do not use the letter V on the ends of words. We do not use the letter J on the ends of words. So there are prohibitions that scribes have imposed on the users of English over several centuries that are just built into the patterns that we have to learn. There are certain letters that are never doubled in English and so on. And then the layer of morphology and the representation of the meaningful parts of words is very important in teaching spelling, and even the part of speech of a word, which has to do with, or which is related to suffixes and how suffixes are spelled, is important for learning to spell. I learned from Marcia Henry many years ago the usefulness of this chart. If you're a teacher of spelling, this is kind of the whole thing, that it gets covered, if you will, in elementary school. Sound symbol correspondences, syllable patterns, morpheme structures from Anglo-Saxon, morpheme structures from Latin, certain spellings for Greek-based words that are unique, and combining forms and plurals from Greek that we learn especially in our scientific and mathematical vocabularies. So just a quick few points here about language of origin. Well, right away, if you're teaching kids about CH, for example, they're going to notice that in school, the CH doesn't represent ch, as you just taught them. And you need to be able to explain that by saying, well, when words, English was built from languages, especially Anglo-Saxon, Latin, and Greek, but also French, and increasingly other languages that feed words into English. So character starts with CH, but it represents K. CH represents K, as it does in school. Machine, CH represents sh, because this is a French derivation. So it's okay to say, well, we're going to learn CH as ch, but you're going to find that CH does other jobs as well. Phoneme grapheme mapping is a very important process for teaching kids the inner workings of words, both in speech and in print. We map, this actually I first saw in the work of Benita Blackman, and then Kathy Grace, who's been a teacher in Vermont and who's written a manual on phoneme grapheme mapping, has very good guidance about this process and how to teach it. I think we need to be explicitly teaching kids about the vowels and how they are spelled, and use this chart of common vowel spellings as a kind of guideline in building a scope and sequence for teaching spelling. It looks like this in a first grade classroom. If you need these charts, they're in the speech to print book and also in letters. And then spelling by syllable is really important, breaking words into their syllabic units and having kids pronounce those syllabic units, even while we're teaching them the morphemes, because many kids with dyslexia don't even pronounce all of the syllables in spoken word, and they need to slow down and say fantastic and write each of these syllables in a box or on a masonite board or whatever trick you're going to use. Morphology we've talked about. Common prefixes, roots, and suffixes, because many of these are spelled consistently. So once kids can get to the level of spelling by meaning, emphasizing morphology is very helpful in building their spelling skills. So I'll wrap up with this. Spelling lessons are an opportunity to teach language, which is the common denominator linking reading, spelling, and writing. And I've been a proponent for making sure that teachers, all teachers, learn this information about the structure of our language so that they can make it explicit for kids. I, of course, worked on the IDA knowledge and practice standards for all teachers of reading. Those, fortunately, are getting a lot of attention, and the IDA is doing a great job with its certification and accreditation processes based on those standards. So let's continue that work. So, all right, I am going to stop screen sharing, and we'll go back to looking at each other. And I know we have some questions coming.
Yes, we do. Thank you so much, Louisa. That was amazing. We have several questions. Heidi, do you want to start with the questions, please?
Sure. So the first one is from a parent. My daughter's reading specialist is using OG during her special education time. The classroom is using Words Their Way. Should she continue Words Their Way or
No.
OG spelling?
The answer to that is no.
I'm glad I'm here with you. I was
and Words Their Way is not designed for dyslexic kids. There's not the linguistic depth there, and it doesn't. It's just not. It's not as linguistically informed and sophisticated as it ought to be, especially for kids who need to have language structure taught to them explicitly and systematically.
Thank you.
Well, that was easy.
Yeah, that was a nice quick no. And I saw that firsthand in my district. So I'm glad that you said that. Doreen, do you want to take another question, or I can do the next one as well?
Go right ahead, Heidi. I'm actually taking lots of notes myself.
Okay, awesome. So
I do have a question that comes up frequently in the parents and children that I work with, and it sort of goes into what was just discussed, but sometimes the kids will have things like foundations in their tier 1 level, and then they get pulled out for, say, their tier 3 support, and they get different spelling. So it's focusing on a different concept than the tier 1. Should the child be getting 2 spelling lists or 1 spelling list? Who should be driving the bus? What do you think?
Well, okay, let's all just consider a basic principle of teaching and learning. And that is that you know, especially for kids who don't just pick it up, you teach them one system in one way, sequentially, cumulatively, with a lot of practice. And you don't confuse the student by introducing something else that's going to compete for their mental resources. We have to be a little more considerate of the position the student is in. So as far as driving the bus, I think these people ought to work it out, but it seems to me that the learning specialist probably has the best diagnostic information that's the most specific about where the student is in a progression of learning that makes sense. So that's what I would recommend they stick with.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that articulate response that I think a lot of parents face with their children and practitioners.
okay, next question is there an age where it's too late to teach spelling, like for middle schoolers and high schoolers that were identified late as being dyslexic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. And I have to avoid giving a glib answer here because realistically, there are obstacles when kids are older. One is they're fed up and not motivated to work on that anymore. They just want tools to navigate around it. And they want both the assistive technology and proofreading help and other kinds of supports and accommodations so that they can get on with their lives and learn to produce writing. However, if the student just has not been taught how the language works, and that's the case in many instances, it can be very informative and kind of comforting, finally, that someone has shed some light on how the system works. So while you probably are not going to see a huge jump in spelling scores, if you will, if you work on spelling, I think it's really important to try to find the opening to teach the structure of language. And instead of calling it spelling, I would call it word study. And I would approach it from a speech to print angle and help the student understand things like there are 18 vowel sounds. And a vowel is not a letter. It is the sound that's the nucleus of the syllable, etc. Because when I teach this to teachers, it's a revelation to them. No one has taught them these things. So of course it's going to be a revelation to the students. And the students, many of them are capable of learning these concepts and making progress. So you can call it linguistics, you can call it word study. My colleague who's still in Vermont, Bruce Rosso, does this now just as a private tutor. And he has so many stories about older kids who are bright and dyslexic, for whom it's just an absolute revelation that someone can make sense out of this for them. When they've been trying, as I described before, to just, memorize letter sequences and imprint those letters on their brains and they don't stick. Well, if you have cognitive handles, like these different angles for thinking about words, it can really help. And it can help in, even if a student, let's say the word accommodate, they can't remember how many letters are double, whatever, but they're going to get closer in looking at what the word processor offers up or what the spell checker offers up, or they're going to have some idea where to look in the dictionary, or they're going to be aware that this word is a homophone and they've got to be careful about which form of there, your they're going to be using. They're going to stop and think. So the instruction does pay off if you can engage the student at an age-appropriate level, thinking about it as a study of linguistics.
Thank you so much for that thoughtful answer. So we only have, we're going over, right? We have one more minute. So do you want to take one more question and then
Sure.
we'll wrap it up?
Yeah.
All right. How about one more question, everyone? Someone?
Oh, there's so many great ones.
There's a lot of great questions. Yes.
I think the big question of the day is what is presenting higher level institutions from teaching structured literacy and the science of reading? I think that kind of sums up many other questions that we have.
Well, let me address that. Number one is ignorance, which is not a kind thing to say, but it's nevertheless been documented in studies of what the faculty members know about these language concepts, that when you sit down and ask them how many morphemes are in the word frogs, and only 26% say two, which is from a study in Scientific Studies of Reading, which is the most outstanding journal we have. Malt Joshi et al., Texas A&M, documented, and as we've documented in our work with faculty members in Mississippi who, bless their hearts, got on board when the whole state decided they were tired of being last and they were going to improve the reading scores of kids in that state, which is not known for being progressive in any way, as we know, as New Englanders. They've transformed the instruction that goes on in the schools of ed, because the faculty both were incentivized and rewarded and supported in learning information that they should have had themselves in their own preparation, but didn't get. So it's made an enormous difference. So that's number one. It's just the knowledge base has not been there, and it is hard to get faculty members, especially in larger institutions that have a kind of, what would you say, a kind of identity as teaching a certain approach or philosophy. To get them to change that is very hard, even in the face of unremitting evidence that the stuff they're teaching and the resources they're using are uninformed by the science that we have. And I'm old now, and I'm very impatient with this, because our kids and our teachers are losing out because of this intransigence and the resistance and the defensiveness and the blogs and the twisting of the language that we're using to cover, to say, oh, well, we've been teaching this all along, which is not true, simply not true. So I think, all the people on this call who have experienced firsthand the consequences of poor teacher preparation, reinforcement of bad ideas and bad practices, and who know the consequences of this, you should be as outraged as I've always been. Speak up, challenge the malpractices, bring the better information to bear. Heaven knows we have so much of it. And press on. This is how we get change. And we've seen that changes happen in a lot of states. I'm happy to say, actually, that today I reviewed the dyslexia guidelines for the state of Massachusetts that are recent. They were published early this year. There's a lot of good information in there, and a lot of accountability. And, that kind of thing ought to be everywhere, because what is described as appropriate for dyslexic kids is couched within a description of what all reading instruction needs to include and what all teachers of reading need to know and practice. And it's a matter of degree and intensity and pace and so on that distinguishes the tiers. It's not the basic way you teach kids how to read.
So thank you so much.
Yeah.
And our mission as the International Dyslexia Association is to have structured literacy in grades K through 2 in the entire country and the world. So thank you so much, Dr. Moats, for leading us on this mission to provide structured literacy to that population and to everyone, because as we know, it is appropriate for all students and especially those with dyslexia. It is essential. Thank you so much for being our guest this evening and for leading us. Thank you to all of our attendants, our guests. Our next session will be on February 9th. Our guest will be Dr. Tiffany Hogan out of Mass General, and she will be talking about the IDA fact sheet oral language. So be sure to sign up for that. When we leave in a moment, end the webinar, you will be taken to a questionnaire. Please fill out the questionnaire for us. It helps us to decide what you need or what you want to hear next. So again, thank you, Dr. Moats, for this amazing presentation and for supporting our branch.